protected areas. Sweet.
Hi, my name is Avery Ancell. My pronouns are she, hers. I am born and raised here in Colorado. My background is in marine conservation, field biology, and ecotourism. And as a conservationist, I want to focus on biocultural conservation and the implications of ecotourism to empower local communities.
Hi, as I mentioned, my name is Hawkins, she, her pronouns. I was born and raised in North Carolina and have a background in botany, environmental education, and conservation. I really enjoy cross-cultural work, such like we did here.
And I'm Jess. I was also born and raised in Colorado. My pronouns are she, her. I've spent 17 years in school and 4 years working full-time in human resources and recruiting. So I've developed a strong foundation for working with people, and I am aiming to bridge that with my passion for conservation.
Yeah, so as you can see, we all come from drastically different backgrounds, which actually really benefited us. We had all different strengths that we pulled together for a really strong collaboration for this project. In addition to the three of us, we had two other project members. So Dr. Eduardo Najera Hillman is the CSU advisor for Mexico engagement. He's located in Todos Santos, and he was our primary advisor down in Mexico, as well as a local engagement liaison for our team. He was absolutely integral to creating those local connections for us to be able to do this project, especially in such a short time span. In addition, we also worked with Antonio Diego Fernandez Rosada, who is the Zero Waste Coordinator for CSU Todos Santos. He's also located down in Todos Santos, and he was our translator on the project, as well as truly a mentor to all of us. So wonderful. I'm gonna get us started with some of the background. So as I mentioned, our project partner was the Comisión Nacional de Áreas Naturales Protegidas, or as you'll hear us refer to it as, CONAP. They were formed in 2000 and are a Mexican federal agency that's responsible for the management of all protected areas in Mexico. So that includes national parks, flora and fauna biosphere, flora and fauna protected areas, and most importantly to our project, biosphere reserves. For our purposes, you can kind of think of CONAP as a national park service. They function a little bit differently. However, for the purpose of this, it's really a great connection for that. We specifically partnered with Sierra Laguna, their Sierra Laguna office down in Todos Santos. But the overall mission of CONAP is to protect ecological health and biodiversity while supporting sustainable human development. One of the ways they do this is by administering subsidies to landowners to be able to complete projects. A little bit more about those subsidy programs that they administer. So a subsidy is money from the government to help reduce the cost of a project. And specifically here, they are hoping to encourage residents to engage in direct management and give a form of alternative livelihood. So when I say direct management, I'm talking about the sustainable use of natural resources. And that can look like a number of things, but some examples would be protection, restoration, or economic valuation of environmental natural services. They had about 9 programs when they started this subsidy program, but they've condensed it down into 2 umbrella programs in 2020. So we'll be focusing on those in this presentation in our work. So the first is ProCodes, which hopes to promote the sustainable use of natural resources and biodiversity by communities living in or near protected areas. The second is ProRest, which hopes to create technical studies for effective management and promote direct participation of local populations in conservation and restoration to support economic growth. So that could look like fire prevention, reforestation, or invasive species management. So about 80% of the funding of these programs goes towards conservation, and the remaining 20% goes towards tourism activities. We were made aware in our very first meeting with CONAP that they believe that the funding for these programs has decreased over time. So that was where we started, but let's get a little bit more into where we were before we get more into that. So as I mentioned, CONAP is in charge of biosphere reserves. So let's talk a little bit about what that is, because it's different than a lot of the protected areas we think of here in the US. Here we think of national parks or state parks that have absolutely no humans in them. They've been either kicked off the land historically or just aren't allowed there now. We visit them, but we can't stay there. For biosphere reserves, it's specifically a focus on the relationship between the land and the people. So to become a biosphere reserve, you have to obtain a UNESCO designation by nomination from the federal government, and then the Man and Biosphere Program of UNESCO will provide that designation.
What is UNESCO?
UNESCO is the United Nations
Environmental
Science
Cultural Organization.
Yes. They serve three main functions. The first is the conservation of biological and cultural biodiversity. The second is economic development that is socio and culturally sustainable. And the third is to provide logistical support through training, monitoring, and research. So a little bit more about our specific biosphere reserve. The Sierra Laguna Biosphere Reserve, or RBISLA, was created in 1994. However, it wasn't designated as a specific biosphere reserve until 2003. It's 300,000 acres located here in Baja California. So you can see on this map, we were in the Baja California Peninsula, specifically in Baja California Sur, down at the very, very tip. We'll have a map later that shows kind of where exactly the Biosphere Reserve was, but this is a map of where the Sierra Laguna Mountains were, and we were located right here in Todos Santos. So the Sierra Laguna Biosphere Reserve has really, really important environmental characteristics. It's really geographically isolated, which creates a similar effect to kind of that of like island biogeography, meaning that it has really, really high biodiversity and a really high rate of endemism, which is plants or animals that are only located in this area. So because of these levels of high environmental importance and endemism, there's a high rate of tourism here. In addition, one of the most important environmental services that it provides is that it provides about 90% of the water to the surrounding cities in Baja California Sur. So as I have here, it's the most important water catchment and recharge area. So it provides water to La Paz, both Cabos, and Todos Santos. It has about 500 residents currently living. As I mentioned, it's a little bit different because it has people living in it as opposed to being kicked out. The traditional livelihood of these residents has been ranching and small-scale farming. So subsistence farming for their family specifically, less selling out. But that has been the livelihood that people have had for generations and generations and generations here. We'll talk a little bit more about that specifically as we go. However, one of the reasons we were brought in as a team is because there's been a shift. So people started out mostly in this ranching livelihood, as I mentioned. However, recently, they've been moving towards ecotourism as a new model for their livelihood. There's also been a drastic increase in visitation since 2020. Kind of what we saw everywhere, people were getting outside in 2020 during the pandemic, and it was no different here. They had an exponential increase in the number of people that were coming here while having, as I mentioned previously, a lack of funding. I'm going to pass it on over to Avery to talk a little bit more about our social ecological system.
Hi. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about our socio-ecological system, specifically on the shifting livelihoods within the Biosphere Reserve from ranching to ecotourism. So kicking off with these two yellow boxes here. So these are our legacy effects. So what that really means is it's a single occurrence or a single event that's had a lasting impact on the system for end all time. So the first one is COP-PNA goals. That probably means nothing to anyone without an explanation. And so what that is Conference of Parties Protected Natural Area goals. So in the 1990s, we saw a rise in global powers coming together to talk about things like climate change, biodiversity loss, so things like the Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and those conferences of parties. They came up with a new idea for what a protected natural area should be, focusing more on the involvement of both people and the ecosystem instead of kicking people out of protected areas that just encompass nature. In addition, we have CONAMP being established in 2000. So as Anna Hawkins mentioned, the Biosphere Reserve existed 6 years before CONAMP did. And so it was basically locally managed by landowners and ranchers within the Biosphere Reserve. And so once CONEP came in and offered this top-down management of the system, as you can imagine, things completely shifted in terms of how everything was done there. In addition, we have a couple social ecological factors. So these are the interplay of both social, people-related, and nature factors. So the local knowledge of species, as Anna Hawkins mentioned as well, there's been centuries of people living here in this area. And so over time, they've acquired a lot of local knowledge that has been pertinent to their ranching livelihood, but also can serve as an asset for their ecotourism ventures as well. And also as a result of that ranching for years and years and years, we've seen a lot of erosion in the area. We got to see this firsthand when we were there, just the cliffs kind of decimated and a lack of plants and stuff just from years and years of cattle ranching in the area. Another social ecological factor is the high endemism that's led to the tourism in the area. So a lot of endemic species, including a lot of reptiles, birds, and plant species that are attracting some niche tourism for like bird watchers and people that are really interested in seeing these unique species coming in and flocking to the area from all around the world. Our next factor is a spatial heterogeneity factor, which once again, pretty jargony, but basically it's like how places differ from one another. And so with this one, it's less visitation compared to other protected natural areas. And so compared to other protected areas in Baja California Sur, Rabisla has significantly less people that are going there. A lot of the focus on the peninsula is a marine base, which makes a lot of sense. And so you have places like Cabo Pulmo, which is one of the best dive sites in the world. So a lot of people are coming internationally for those. So even though we have seen an increase in visitation, it's still been significantly less compared to the other protected natural areas in the region. We also have a couple temporal factors, so things that have shifted over time in the region. So as I mentioned, increased visitation since the pandemic. There's been way more people and way less capacity to handle more people coming in. Also, we see generational emigration in the area, so people moving out of the Biosphere Reserve to go to local city centers like Cabo and Todos Santos and La Paz. And this is indicative of a larger global shift that we see as well, where a lot of newer generations of rural livelihoods are transitioning to a more urban basis. We also have a complexity factor acting on the system, which is climate change. This is kind of inevitable at this point. It's acting on pretty much every system, but specifically on Rabisla, we're seeing not only rising temperatures, but a higher frequency of dramatic weather events. So more extreme droughts, more extreme hurricanes, and flooding in the region. So that's definitely shaped how people are handling and managing their lands and the way they approach their livelihood. Finally, we have two multi-scalar factors that are impacting the system. One is the lack of CONAMP capacity. So we've dabbled in this so far, but the federal agency of CONAMP has given far less money to the Sierra Laguna specific chapter. And this is a trend we've seen across all of Mexico, just a lot less funding being given over time. But there hasn't been really any formal acknowledgement of that or any formal data done to show that that's what's happening. Finally, there's a land tenure system. And so land tenure is the ownership of certain property and how it's passed down over generations. And so this is another multi-scalar effect because there's been some discrepancy in who owns certain properties within the Biosphere Reserve, and also CONAMP's role in that of designating these land to certain people can lead to a series of conflicts. So we'll get into that a little more. Sweet, and to go over our objectives. So our first meeting with CONAMP at Sierra Laguna, we recognized that they had this lack of capacity to do the adequate monitoring that they felt necessary within the Biosphere Reserve. So that's where we were able to step in and conduct some monitoring for them. They also have a meeting coming up with the federal branch of CONAMP next month. And so we're hoping that they're able to use our project as a way to advocate not only on behalf of the Sierra Laguna agency, but on behalf of the local peoples that are in the area as well. So our first objective is to evaluate the effectiveness and perceived value of CONAMP subsidy programs. And we did this through a series of informal conversations and data analysis. Our second objective is to document and analyze the transition from traditional ranching to ecotourism and rural landowners. And then our third objective is to develop visual communication tools for CONAMP. And once again, not only visual communication tools for them to advocate to the federal branch, but for people within the Biosphere Reserve to have a greater conceptual understanding of how the reserve is being managed. Awesome, so getting into our methods, we had the opportunity to conduct some really cool social science field work on site in Baja. We were there for about 8 weeks, and so it was go time, because that's a really short time to do a whole project. And so, yeah, we made the most of every day. But yeah, we had 6 different sites that we visited within the Biosphere Reserve. All were dedicated towards having an ecotourism activity. And with our site visits, we conducted one initial one that was geared specifically towards doing the touristic activity. So that was a lot of fun. We had the opportunity to like try out a lot of different, fun tourist activities and play that side. And then our next time we visited, we guided some informal conversations. So we came into this with like an inductive perspective, not really a set question list in mind or anything, just seeing what arose in our conversations with different ranchers. And finally, we had the opportunity to conduct a SWOT analysis at an ecological monitoring workshop at one of our sites. And this was a really special opportunity. I think all of us feel very strongly about this. We were really nervous because it was all in Spanish that we had to do this. And we were just on site for multiple days. It was an incredible experience though, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then from these informal conversations and the SWOT analysis, we conducted a qualitative analysis of all the conversations we had. And then we also did a quantitative analysis of a couple different databases that CONAMP had. So 2 public access data sets that were comprised of data on subsidies funding for every protected natural area within Mexico. And then 1 data set specific to Revisla's CONAMP chapter that was what landowners were getting what subsidy during what year and the description of each activity that they were pursuing for the subsidy. Sweet, so pass it on.
Yep. Good. So as Avery mentioned, we had 6 project sites. They were all located within the Sierra Laguna Biosphere Reserve. So this blue line here shows where the boundaries of that Biosphere Reserve is. And then we have points that denote where each one of our sites were. I'm going to go a little bit more into detail about what the ecotourism activities were that were offered at these sites. So as you can see, we have a picture for each site that kind of gives a general idea of what ecotourism activities were offered. So starting up at the top here with Los Encinos de Don Juan and Rancho Santa Rita, those 2 were actually directly next to each other and they were brothers. So the 2 landowners were family. Their primary ecotourism activity was these thermal pools that were created by a hurricane coming through in the 1970s that actually altered the shift of the river in the area. So they chose to capitalize on these by walling them in different ways for tourism use. However, in addition, they have other ecotourism activities offered here, like just hanging out in the river next to it, as well as camping and a few other smaller services. Something really important that we wanted to note about Santa Rita is that they were the first ranch in the area to do ecotourism. And this came about naturally, which is really interesting because a lot of times ecotourism occurs by like force of a federal government saying like, you're living on this land, this is a way to survive. But this actually happened very naturally. People were coming onto the land and using these thermal pools. And it was particularly unsafe. And so the landowner found a way and partnered with CONAMP as a way to provide regulations, but also as capital for him. Moving on down, Sol de Mayo. As you can see in that picture there, that was probably one of our favorite ecotourism sites. It's this gorgeous 20, 30-foot waterfall that's just absolutely incredible, hidden in the middle of the desert, really, and just a great site. However, they had a really, really robust ecotourism venture just outside of that. They also had a restaurant, camping, and are currently developing a program to do canyoneering through that canyon behind there. as well as going to some of the only oases in North America. And part of this is because they have a background in alternative tourism. So that really helped them bolster their ecotourism abilities. In addition, they represent a really, really interesting and really important theme, which is that the people that live at Sol de Mayo, their children are 8th generation on this land. They have been here for generations and generations. This is their land, this is their home, and they take a lot of pride in it. These ecotourism ventures are a way to share that without having to give up their land. Moving on, San Dionisio was kind of our outlier. So the ecotourism that was provided here was primarily hiking and camping opportunities for the area because of the surrounding mountains that people like to hike and camp in. But interestingly enough, this was owned, again, for generations by locals. However, it was left abandoned and actually was recently bought by a man from Colorado. So we went all the way to Mexico to meet another guy from Colorado. But he represents a really interesting theme because he represents a little bit of a fear that these people hold. As Avery mentioned with the land tenure system, it's not entirely clear always who owns the land or where the titles are. And so there's a certain fear of foreigners coming in and taking this land. I would like to note, however, that the man who currently owns it did it a really incredible way. He talked to all the neighbors and made sure they were okay with him moving in before purchasing this land. This is not slander. Moving on down, El Refugio has a special place in all of our hearts. It was where we did our first site visit, our first ecotourism adventure, as well as where we hosted our SWOT analysis. The landowner prides himself in kind of traditional lifestyle ecotourism ventures. So tortilla making, working with leather, home cooked meals, as well as a significant amount of subsistence farming still occurring here. Rogelio, who's one of the landowners, showed us really what true conservation leadership means. He's heavily involved in the conservation of this area and is deeply passionate about it. One of his main projects is working to restore oaks that are endemic only to this area. So finally, we have Rancho La Rueda. La Rueda primarily rented out mules and tour guides to hike up into the mountains. And La Rueda represented two really important themes for us. The first being safety, which I mentioned in other sides, but they have a lot of people who come in overconfident for this hike, and they have to go out and rescue them and use their own time and resources since they know the land best. In addition, they represented seasonality. So the owners of La Rueda are only open their land for probably 3 to 4 months of the year and split their time between their ranch and Todos Santos. That was something we saw as a common theme among all of our places. While they were open all year, they saw different tourists coming in during different seasons. So primarily international tourists during winter months when it's chilly and you want to go somewhere warm. And they saw a lot more locals during the summer months when people were out of school there. So I'm going to pass it off to Jess to talk a little bit more some of our qualitative analysis we did with our interviews from here.
Thank you so much. So I will go ahead and go into a little bit more detail about the qualitative analysis that we did. So we collected information at each site through informal interviews, field observations, and then we conducted a participatory SWOT analysis at one of CONAP's scheduled trainings. And then we went ahead and kept our process conversational throughout. So we allowed participants to guide the conversations, which allowed themes to go ahead and emerge naturally. And using the data that we collected, we came together as a team to conduct an inductive thematic analysis. So that means that we didn't start with any predetermined categories. Instead, like I said, we allowed those themes to emerge naturally from what people said. Then we went ahead and grouped similar ideas under broader categories like subsidy perceptions, conservation awareness, and institutional challenges. And through that process, patterns began to surface. So, for example, many participants described ecotourism subsidies as initial capital and a starting point to adventure into ecotourism or to develop infrastructure on their ranch. And others emphasized trust and communication, expressing that their relationship with CONAP was stronger because of these factors, and those influenced how successful subsidy programs felt. And we also paid attention to site-specific differences over here. Like the ranchers at Sol de Mayo, they bring new skills in tourism, they have formal education in gastronomy, and then seasonal ranches like La Rueda tended to prioritize ranching traditions and water management. And those nuances helped us understand that there's no single pathway towards sustainability. Each community adapted differently based on their landscape, their priorities, and their history. Okay, and for this part of our project, we did a SWOT analysis. SWOT stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And our goal here was to strengthen our understanding of how ranchers themselves perceive subsidies and ecotourism and conservation. And once again, the SWOT workshop was also conversational. So we invited ranchers to express their experiences with CONAP programs like ProCodes and ProRest, and we used color-coded sticky notes to capture their ideas in real time. And our goal was not to evaluate our participants, but we wanted to create a space for mutual reflection. That way, their voices could guide future program considerations. Some of the strengths that emerged were the sense of pride and stewardship that many ranchers felt towards their land, and tangible benefits such as improved infrastructure and water catchments, which were supported through subsidy programs. Weaknesses often centered on administrative complexity, such as not knowing how to apply for funding, feeling that program follow-up was inconsistent, or that all of the paperwork in between was just a little bit too noisy. And on the opportunity side, ranchers saw huge potential for expanding ecotourism, especially in younger generations. There was a lot of energy around local ecotourism and intergenerational knowledge exchange. And finally, the threats reflected bigger systematic challenges, such as water scarcity, drought, and the ongoing pressures of rapid development across Baja California Sur. Those are issues that go beyond individual ranches and point to the need for strong coordination and watershed planning. So overall, our SWOT analysis was a process that helped us move from data collection to dialogue. And it was one of the most rewarding parts of our project because it let us see how research and community priorities can come together in a way that's constructive. It also gave us a deeper understanding of how the community shapes the landscape. Through those conversations, we began to understand conservation as something rooted in place, in relationships, traditions, and shared stewardship of the land. All right, and then I'll go ahead and move into our themes. So after coding our interviews and workshop notes, we went ahead and developed a code book where several key themes emerged around livelihood transitions, perceptions of subsidies, and environmental awareness. And our analysis helped us understand how people in the Sierra Laguna region perceive subsidies and ecotourism. Our word cloud was derived from our codebook, and it visualizes the most common themes that occurred across all of our interviews. So the larger words represent the most frequently mentioned topics, such as tourism, family, water, conservation, livelihood diversification. And then what stood out to us from these themes was how interconnected they all were. So conversations about water often led into discussions about drought, about climate change, and about ranching. And water scarcity was not just mentioned, it was felt. And when ranchers spoke about ecotourism, it wasn't just about income. It was also about pride and heritage and sharing their land with visitors in a respectful way. We also heard several comments about safety. So many ranchers assumed the responsibility of caring for visitors on their land. For them, safety wasn't just a logistical concern, but it was also a way of showing care for their land and for the visitors who came to experience it. This theme came up especially in conversations about infrastructure need, emergency response, and the importance of clear rules for visitors. Words like support, communication, and follow-up also appeared in the code book, and those reflected a desire for stronger collaboration with CONAP and clearer follow-up after subsidy implementation. So overall, our word cloud shows that this project was not just about understanding the challenges that these ranchers faced, but also recognizing the aspirations and the values that the community holds. Many participants also emphasized wanting to continue conserving their land, but in ways that are practical, dignified, and sustainable for their families. And these themes then became the foundation for our considerations and helped us connect local perspectives to conservation goals.
So I'm going to shift us. I'm going to shift us a little bit from our qualitative to our quantitative analysis. So we're moving a little bit more from kind of that transition, really more into our subsidies. This map was created from a data set that was given to us by CONAP that tracks all of the subsidies funding that was given out from the years 2010 to 2025. So this map specifically represents the top 15% or top 15 earners of subsidies and funding that were given. And just starting over here for a little bit of context, you can see that it's a pretty even distribution. We'll switch sides. Pretty even distribution between how many subsidies were given and how much money was given across the board. So bringing that over into the map here, first thing to note is that the majority of the ranches that had the most funding all laid on the outside of kind of right on the border of the Biosphere Reserve. One thing that we theorize is that this could be a potential for ecotourism. More people can access the outer pieces of the Biosphere Reserve than that inside. As well as these are areas that are generally closer to larger towns such as La Paz, Cabo, and Todos Santos. Another thing to note about this map is kind of this cluster right here that has a significant amount of funding. One thought we had for that is because it's on the western side of the mountain range, it's in the drier area. So it might need more funding for projects such as building dams to conserve water on an individual basis. Going off of that, another thing that's really important to note here is that there were 3 types of kind of ranches from this database. Individual ranches, canyons that were comprised of a number of ranches, and ejidos, which are government-owned land that are communally managed by the people. And it was really hard to distinguish, actually you couldn't distinguish in the database which was which. So that is a limitation to this, just as a note. However, with that, one theory that we came up with is, so for some of our bigger ones, such as San Jose and San Dionisio, those might be more canyon-based because they received funding for projects that were benefited the entire canyon instead of just a single place. Furthermore, on San Dionisio, there's a couple things I want to note here. The first being, it's kind of hard to see, but it runs along this river. That's really important for ecotourism because a lot of the ecotourism activities, as I mentioned, were water-based. So especially in an area that's generally hot and arid, it's really great to have somewhere you can take like a cool dip off. So that might be one of the reasons that they have some more funding. But in addition, they might be doing more conservation since they are a little bit further here in than a lot of our other ranches. So more conservation, your land gets prettier, you have more opportunity for ecotourism. And yeah, that's what I have. I'm gonna pass it over to Avery to talk a little bit more about some of the quantitative analysis that we did.
Yeah, I'm gonna come on this side.
Yeah.
Sweet. So this is our first graph. This one is stemming from one of those public data sets that encompasses all of the protected natural areas in Mexico, not specifically Rabisla, And so we honed in specifically on Baja California Sur, the protected areas within this region. A couple of things to note about the title. Okay, so 2024, that's the most recent year that there was a completed data set for this. Pro codes, if you remember from Anna Hawkins' slide, that is our sustainable development subsidy. So it's specifically relating to people engaging with the environment in the protected natural area. And then authorized funding is another important note to make for not only this graph, but all of my graphs, subsequent graphs. And that's because this is the money that has been given to them, not necessarily the amount of money that has been requested by people. So it's an important distinction to make that it's also unclear in the database whether or not the federal version of CONAMP is giving them this much and that's all they could get, or if this is what people ask, that is also unclear. So just note that for the rest of the graphs here. But yeah, so what we can see with this pie chart is Rabisla right here, this orange triangle. And so you can see they're getting a significant amount of this funding, at least in 2024. So it's about 20% or $72,900 US in 2024. And we think that there's a tie between the fact that it's a biosphere reserve and the fact that this subsidy is a sustainable development one. It makes more sense that a place that has people living in it, like Sierra Laguna or another biosphere reserve, El Vizcaino, are going to see a lot more funding for people-related ecosystem activities than somewhere like Balandra, which is an estuary in La Paz that has no one living inside of it, and it's just a small parcel of land. Awesome. So our next graph is looking at the total funding. Whoa. Total funding for all subsidy projects over time in Rabisla. So this is going back to that database that Anna Hawkins highlighted in her map, but specifically focusing in on Sierra Laguna, not across all protected natural areas. And so what we can see here is a slight decrease in funding. It's not that dramatic, but yeah, you can see this line for funding for subsidies has been declining over recent years. And what really adds some context to this is the inclusion of the consumer price index. And so that's a metric from the World Bank. And basically it's showing how much inflation is happening. And so let's say you pay a certain amount of money for a banana at the start of this, and then the same banana is going to cost significantly more by the end of this. Can you tell I'm not an economist? And yeah, so with that, it's contributing to this loss of funding. So as there's an inverse correlation between the consumer price index increasing and the total funding going down. And so CONAMP's suspicions were correct. They're losing a significant amount of funding from the federal agency, and they haven't had any way to show this to the federal agency until now, because it's just been speculated and talked about and there hasn't been any analysis. So we were happy to prove their point with this one. It's just been talk. I'm sorry. No, you're great. Awesome. Okay, so this next graph, this is a categorical graph that we made from that Rabisla specific database. And so part of the database was a lot of descriptions on certain projects. And so a way to clean that up, we grouped larger themes of projects individual landowners did, by those broader themes. And so we could see what types of projects people wanted to focus their energy on. So what you can see here is restoration had the highest amount of funding out of any projects over time in Rabisla. And so restoration, that's going to be like rehabilitation of degraded land and reforestation. Second to that, we have dams. So dam projects include the construction of masonry and stone dams on individual properties. And then we had fires in the third spot there. And that's like fire management. And so like taking away bramble that might burn easily, making a plan if there's a large scale wildfire, and doing some controlled burning. Another thing to note about this graph is what wasn't funded over time in Rabisla, and so what hasn't seen a lot of funding. And so like specifically with waste management, we ended up talking a lot about waste management with Antonio as the zero waste coordinator, did a lot of composting. But with waste management, we only saw one branch that had any infrastructure for taking care of their waste. So that could be an area where they might see more funding in the future if that becomes a priority for the people there. So go to the next one. Sorry. Okay, sweet. And so this graph is based on the last one. So we highlighted the 3 types of projects that receive the most funding: restoration, dams, and fire projects. And then we also decided to include ecotourism, even though it did not get that much funding, just for the purpose of our project relevance to that specific topic. A couple things you can note about this graph. First is just the amount of volatility within the system. There's a lot of fluctuation between the years of all of these types of projects getting funding. And so that could be indicative of just uncertainty in the system. As we know, the federal agency has been kind of wishy-washy with giving people funding. And so that could be indicative of that. It also could be that some of these projects are a one and done type of project. So you wouldn't necessarily need 18 more restoration projects after you just did some, because they're going to hold weight over time. Another thing to note about this is the correlation between the ecotourism line and the restoration line. And so we thought that was interesting, because I think a lot of the ecotourism that we saw was really done in tandem with restoration. And so when you have a property that you need to reforest, of course, that's going to improve the touristic activities that are happening there as well. Another thing to note, this spike in 2020 with restoration, and so we're just speculating, but we're guessing it's probably because COVID was happening and people were having more time and energy to spend on restoring their lands without anything else going on in the world at the time. And then finally, that fire spike there, where we've seen a significant amount of funding increased in 2025, and there's been a big drought over the past year, and the threat of fire is alive and real in Baja. So we think that's probably in response to this increased likelihood that there's going to be a severe burn.
Yep, so I'll go ahead and take over and talk a little bit more about the shift to ecotourism. So across ranches, we heard a similar story. Ranching has been the backbone of family life for generations. And the reality is that long-term drought, less available spring water, and climate change have caused families to need to adapt. And what's important is that ecotourism was not an external intervention. It was a voluntary, community-driven solution. So ranchers told us that ecotourism allows them to stay connected to their land in a way that's less physically demanding, supports income, and supports conservation. And this quote hopefully illustrates that tourism has not only become a lifeline, but an emotional and cultural evolution. And one of the most interesting parts of our fieldwork was seeing how families reinvented their livelihoods in ways that still honor their history. So younger generations brought those new skills in gastronomy, formal education in tourism, visitor management, and had skills in online communication. And a lot of elders held local knowledge, traditional knowledge of water, plants, wildlife, and land stewardship. And tourism in Sierra Laguna is unique. It is deeply personal and rooted in place. And every tour, every meal, and every conversation reflects generations of knowledge. And it's not mass tourism, it is small scale and rooted in biocultural conservation. All right, and I will go ahead and start rounding us out with some considerations for our project partner, and then followed by a few reflections on the project overall. So as we analyze themes from our interviews and workshop discussions, something that came up repeatedly was the role of CONAP in supporting conservation and ecotourism in the region. Many ranchers expressed appreciation for CONAP's support with subsidies and technical assistance, but they also emphasized CONAP's capacity is limited. So both the level of staffing and the follow-up that they can provide. And that limitation is not supposed to be a criticism. It's just a reality. Sierra Laguna is geographically large. It is hard to access. And as Avery mentioned, it is a deeply complex socio-ecological system. So CONAP is responsible for managing multiple conservation programs all throughout Mexico, and they have constrained budgets and limited staff. So our question here becomes, how can conservation be strengthened when our capacity is stretched so thin? So first, improving data organization could strengthen planning, transparency, and trust. As Anna Hawkins mentioned, right now it's often unclear how to differentiate between ranch names, ejidos, and canyons. And that makes it difficult to tell where subsidies are being allocated and how equitably they're being distributed. So if the data were standardized, it would make it easier to visualize exactly where those resources are going. You could track outcomes better over time and identify areas that might be over or underrepresented. And then our qualitative analysis revealed that ranchers desire more communication with CONAP, especially following program implementation. And the most current management plan was last revised in 2003, so a new management plan may serve as a common operational guide. CONAP can also build on the trust that was formed through the ProCodes and ProRes subsidy programs by promoting peer-to-peer learning and co-management. Additionally, considering integrating rancher-led ecological monitoring to help foster shared ownership of conservation outcomes. Lastly, many ranchers cited their transition to ecotourism due to unsustainable ranching operations, which were exacerbated by drought and climate change. So ranchers brought up infiltration galleries, dams, and watershed planning as essential tools for sustainable development. And a lot of opportunities exist within Sierra Laguna for collaboration. The municipalities that are outside of the reserve, like La Paz and Los Cabos, depend on Sierra Laguna for water. So there is potential for these municipalities to co-invest in watershed restoration, rock dams, and community monitoring programs. Non-government organizations are already working within the region as well, and they have experience with ecological monitoring, community outreach, and environmental education. So strengthening partnerships between CONAP and those local NGOs could also extend the impact of conservation projects and provide more consistent on-the-ground engagement. And finally, private investors and tourism operators who are outside the ranch would also benefit directly from a healthy watershed. So their participation through matching funds, sponsorships, or community grants could significantly scale up restoration and ecotourism infrastructure. So while CONAP may have limited institutional capacity, the broader landscape offers a network of partners who are connected to the region, and they have incentives for keeping the ecosystem healthy. So this opens up the door for collaborative, multi-stakeholder conservation efforts that don't rely solely on federal resources. Perfect. And I will go ahead and talk a little bit more about our reflections too. So this was our first time doing a project like this in a place like this. The rhythms of life were different, the landscape was different, and it was truly an honor and a privilege to learn from those who live and work on the land every single day. We approached our research with deep respect and curiosity, and we learned through working across cultures that adaptability, gratitude, and patience are some of the most important factors in engaging in this type of work. Our collaboration with our partners Antonio and Eduardo was an incredible cross-cultural experience. Their perspectives helped us bridge worlds between academic perspectives and field-based perspectives. It grounded us in the sense of place And it helped us develop respect for the local region. As a team, we learned how to communicate with each other. We acknowledged our differences openly. We learned how to build on each other's strengths. And we came to understand not only the communities that we were working with, but ourselves. So we also engaged in a side project with Antonio to learn about the concept of ikigai. And that project helped to remind us to find our purpose where our passions, our skills, and community needs intersect. And that's a lesson that we'll carry forward with us into our careers as conservation leaders. And when we first started this project, we thought that the most challenging aspect was going to be logistics, such as field site visits, interviews, and data collection. But what really stood out to us was that human collaboration made all of those things possible. And working with Antonio and Eduardo was an incredible experience. We all came from different contexts. We had different academic experiences and different ways of communicating, but we all shared a common commitment to community-centered conservation. Eduardo and Antonio modeled humility, generosity, and a deep connection to place. And within our own team of 3 here, we got to know each other's work styles, like who thrived in structure, who improvised, who caught the small details, and then who saw the big picture. So we also practiced how to speak up and bring things to each other's attention politely. We adjusted when things got hard, and those are learning opportunities that we're going to take with us into our future careers as well. Something that came up in every single interview was the sense of responsibility that landowners felt towards the environment. So before subsidies existed, landowners were already engaging in conservation. They were repairing riparian zones, they were doing trail maintenance, and they were managing fire risk on their own. Their knowledge is experiential and intergenerational. At every single ranch we visited, we watched families navigate ranching, tourism, and restoration side by side. They're not just landowners, but stewards and cultural educators. And the landowners here are doing the work of conservation leadership every single day. And their stories are central to understanding sustainable development in Sierra Laguna. I'll hand it over to.
Sweet. Yeah, and that concludes our presentation. We just want to give a big thank you to CCU Toto Santos for hosting us, Kim Kita for helping us figure out a project last minute that we were so proud of, Brett for guiding us throughout this entire experience, answering our random emails about random questions, and then of course our project team, Antonio and Eduardo. Couldn't have asked for a better group to work with, and of course my project partners. We had a wonderful team, and something I'll treasure for the rest of my life. So thank you guys.